that from persecutor to preacher to prisoner, picking up in Acts 21 where we were 2 weeks ago and advancing to near the end of Acts 22. Now, just so you know that I'm hip and current and up to speed, in preparation for today's lesson, I went to ChatGPT and said, hey, what's a catchy title for a lesson in Acts 22? And ChatGPT said a catchy title would be From Persecutor to Preacher to Prisoner. So just so you know, I didn't come up with that. That was all AI that did that for us. So even your Sunday school lesson has now been affected with AI. So let's get going. Okay. So 2 weeks ago, and Rich, wherever you are, thank you for covering last week. But 2 weeks ago, we observed as Paul wrapped up the third missionary journey, arriving there in Jerusalem. If you remember, once he was in Jerusalem, he proceeded and met with James and the other elders. What was interesting about what Luke recorded there is he didn't mention the apostles at all. He didn't mention them by name. He didn't mention their office. This is the first time we've made it to Jerusalem in the book of Acts, and the apostles are not mentioned. Rather, who's mentioned is James, the Lord's half-brother, who has become the leading pastor in Jerusalem, and other elders in Jerusalem. So already over the roughly 24 to 25 years, we're seeing a transition from an apostle-led body of believers to an elder or pastor-led body of believers. But at any rate, get back on track. Paul met with these elders. He met with James and the other elders. And if you remember, he rehearsed, he reviewed, he echoed all that God had done through those first missionary journeys with the Gentiles. How many countless Gentiles were coming to faith in Yeshua, in Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and placing faith in him and being forgiven of their sins. And he was just recounting all that. And Luke told us it brought great joy, and the elders rejoiced at all that Paul was telling them. But then it told us something else. They said, yeah, but there's a problem. The Jews around here, many have come to faith, and they've been hearing bad things about you, Paul, and what you teach. In fact, I'll take you back to the verse because it has been 2 weeks ago, and we can't remember last week. So let's look at it. And these Jews there in Jerusalem who've come to faith in Jesus have been told about you, Paul, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to the customs. Now, we looked at that 2 weeks ago. All three of those points are incorrect. They're based on a sliver of truth, but they're absolutely false on the face, period. But what was happening is this was spreading in Jerusalem about Paul. And so James and the other elders said, yeah, but that's nice, Paul, what's going on with the Gentiles? We've got a problem brewing here. They're going to hear that you're here. They're going to want you to explain yourself. They're going to want you to give an account. They're going to want you to explain, is this true? Are you telling Jews as they live in other areas not to keep the customs? Are you telling them not to circumcise their children? They're going to want an account. But we've got an idea. We've got 4 men who've taken a vow, likely a Nazirite vow. And here's what we think you ought to do. You ought to take the vow with them, and you ought to pay their way, which means to buy their sacrifices. And in doing that, you're taking the Nazirite vow and paying their way. That'll prove that this is not true. That'll show that you don't stand against Jewish customs. You don't stand against Jewish law. This will be a way to just tamp down the crowd. And again, we're talking about Paul, who became all things for all men, that he might in some way win some. We're talking about Paul, who earlier had already taken a Nazirite vow, so he would have had no problem with this. So likely he took what was a 7-day Nazirite vow. He shaved his head and commenced the vow. If you remember, it was on that 7th day. Luke says on the 7th day. And what 7th day is he talking about? He's likely talking about the end of the Nazirite vow. One of the Jews or Jewish proselytes from Asia Minor saw Paul in the temple. And he said, this is Paul, and he's brought Gentiles in the temple. And Luke told us he had seen Trophimus, who was from Ephesus, who was a Gentile, and he assumed that Paul brought him in the temple, which Paul had not. But it set the whole temple in an uproar. The place exploded. In fact, we read this. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul. They drug him out of the temple. They shut the gates, and they were seeking to kill him. They began to beat Paul, likely right there on the Temple Mount. Word came to the Roman tribune, the Roman captain of the cohort that's there in Jerusalem, that the whole area was in confusion. That's where we ended 2 weeks ago. We ended with Paul being beaten with the plan to beat him to death right there on the Temple Mount off a charge that was not even true. Equally, if it was true, the person that would be punished was the Gentile who went through the gate that said no one should proceed beyond here except at the forfeiture of their own life. But they're beating Paul, and they plan to beat him to death. And that's where we ended last week, in the middle of a riot, much like the one we saw in Ephesus. In your notes, you have a 13-point outline of our lesson today. I won't read those things to you. You do have it in your notes. So where we are, we're on the Temple Mount. I'm going to come forward so I can kind of see my own map here. If you remember, I told you this is called the Sirug. No Gentile could proceed beyond this point. This is the court of women. And so what had happened is they saw Paul somewhere in this area. They assumed that he had brought in a Gentile with him. They grabbed him. They started screaming, he's bringing Gentiles into this holy place. They took him out of the gate, likely one of these gates, more than likely one of the gates back here, and they were beating him. And that's where we ended. On the Temple Mount, no charges being made, no official charges. They're going to beat the Apostle Paul to death. And that brings us to our lesson from persecutor, that's how he started, to preacher. And as we will see today, he will become a Roman prisoner. This will mark 5 years, really, where he will be under Roman confines, most of it under house arrest in Rome. We'll see that soon enough as it plays out. But that's where we are today. That's what's going on. Any questions in the setup before we get to our lesson today? Kitty, and Mike's coming, so let it get there just so people can hear your question who didn't make it today.
This is just one of curiosity for me. How many years did Paul preach before he was executed?
Let's see if I have a quick diagram. Forgive me, I'm going to run real fast. Okay. So Paul was converted sometime around 33 to 34 AD. He would write his last epistles in about 65 AD, likely martyred a couple of years after that. So rough numbers, let's say from 33 to 34 AD to 67 AD, better than 30 years. So his ministry, I've been saved for 31 years. So his ministry was about as long as I've been saved at this point in my life. And hopefully that answered your question, Kitty. Any other questions in the run-up before we get going this morning? By the way, that diagram I just brought up, shameless plug. I made some more changes to that, Rev 6 to that current document. We'll talk about when we get there. I put it back on the miscellaneous document. So if you previously downloaded, it's got some additions to it. I added the Jewish high priest who were serving during the different years, as well as the Roman procurators who were serving, the Roman rulers who were serving over Judea. So that's added to the document just so you keep all this stuff straight when you're reading. Okay, but we'll talk about that soon enough. It's back in the miscellaneous documents. It is Rev 6. But if you downloaded it before, a new one's up. Any other questions before we get running this morning? Okay. Verse 31, picking up in the middle of chapter 21, well, toward the end of 21. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. So we already said that, but let's just say a couple more things about this. So the cohort there is likely in charge of somewhere between 600 and 1,000 soldiers. He's housed in the Antonia fortress. Oh, went the wrong way. He's housed in the Antonia fortress. So the Antonia fortress was annexed onto the Temple Mount. The tribune is housed in this with between 600 and 1,000 Roman soldiers. If you remember where we're at in time, they're celebrating Pentecost, which means all Jewish men are in the city. The city is bustling because that was one of the 3 festival days where all Jewish men were required to go to Jerusalem. The city is bustling with people. The Roman tribune is on his toes waiting for anything to happen because the city is packed full of people. Many of them are Jews. Many of them don't like Romans, so he's probably got soldiers stationed around the Temple Mount. They wouldn't go through the court. They wouldn't go beyond the court of Gentiles, and he's likely got soldiers stationed in the city. He gets word that Jerusalem has been set in confusion. It's been set in an uproar. It's turning into a riot. You're in charge of 600 to 1,000 Roman soldiers there in the Antonia fortress. What are you likely to do? It's exactly what he does. So they're beating Paul. He gets word, verse 32. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune, the soldiers stopped beating Paul. Okay, so you've seen where the Antonia fortress is. You've got it in your mind. he grabs centurions. We don't know if that's 2 or 3 or 4, but keep in mind each centurion would bring with him 100 soldiers. Thank you, Rich. I think you said it. So if he grabbed 2 centurions, who's in tow with those 2 centurions? 200 soldiers. So he's not going down there with a water pistol and 3 cats to break up this confusion. He's going down with at least 2 centurions multiple, and hundreds of soldiers because he hears the city's in confusion and he's in charge. He's the chief captain of this thing for Rome. He goes down, he exits the Antonia fortress. Having heard this, he immediately leaves. As he gets down, likely into that court of Gentiles, that's likely where they were beating Paul. If you're in my mind, they probably likely took him out the gates that were toward the Antonia fortress. They've shut the gates behind him and they're planning on killing him right there. But wherever it was, ultimately, that's right. Ultimately, the Roman tribune and his soldiers show up mid-strike and they stop. You can picture it in your mind, right? They all kind of, because a Roman tribune has shown up with hundreds of soldiers. So they stop off beating Paul. No surprise. I mean, if you're trying to picture this in your mind, picture like the LA riots and one person gets caught in the middle of it. And that person happens to be Paul in this case. Verse 33. Then the tribune came up and arrested Paul and ordered Paul to be bound with 2 chains. And then he inquired who he was and what he had done. Okay, so that I don't bury the lead or bury the backstory, you'll see it in a couple of verses. But the Roman centurion is thinking that Paul is a notorious Egyptian terrorist. You'll see it in a moment. So he gets down there. He's like, I know who this guy is. This is that notorious Egyptian terrorist. So he immediately arrests him, thinking that's who he is. He binds him to 2 soldiers. So he chains him to one soldier and his other arm to the other soldier. He thinks he's dealing with a wicked, vile criminal. And he takes steps to make sure this wicked, vile criminal does not escape. And then he begins to inquire of the crowd to verify who he is, right? These people are beating him, Deb. Surely they know who he is and what he's done. It's a legitimate question. Who is he and what he's done? And so the tribune begins to question, who is he and what he has done? Now, I do wonder, as all this is going on, if he remembered what Agabus had prophesied. When Agabus came down from Jerusalem, and coming to us, Luke writes, he took Paul's belt and he bound his own feet and hands with it. And he says, thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews at Jerusalem will bound the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. What Agabus prophesied is happening right now. If you remember, what's been going on is as Paul has been traveling, everywhere he's been going, God has been revealing prophetically through other believers and maybe even to Paul that what awaited him in Jerusalem was imprisonment and affliction, tribulation. But Paul, because he was compelled, bound in the Spirit, because he knew God's will for him involved going through Jerusalem, like Jesus many years before, 24 years before, has set his face like a flint to go to Jerusalem. Paul was going to Jerusalem because he was convinced that's what God had for him. And here, Agabus' prophecy is finding its fulfillment right there on the Temple Mount. Verse 34. So the tribune goes, okay, who is he and what he has done? Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, because of the riot, because of the tumult, he ordered Paul to be brought into the Antonia fortress, into the barracks. You can imagine, he said, okay, who is he and what he's done? And then it just erupts. And he can't understand. People are screaming. People are yelling. And finally, he recognizes this isn't working. Take him into the fortress. Verse 35. By the way, before I read verse 35, this should remind you of what happened in Ephesus. This is like identical. It's just in Jerusalem. When that riot broke out in Ephesus, Luke recorded, some cried one thing, some another. The assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not even know why they were together. Here it is happening in Jerusalem, all of this chaos. And that brings us to verse 35. And when the tribune and the soldiers came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. Like little chihuahuas nipping at someone's heel, they're still trying to get Paul. They're still trying to reel him back in. In my mind, the Romans have got Paul up like this, trying to get him in the garrison. The tribune doesn't want to start killing people there on Pentecost. He just wants to kind of end this chaos. And the Jews are trying to get at Paul, and they've got Paul crowd surfing, if you will, into the barracks. I don't know what it looked like, but in my mind, that's what it looks like. They're actually lifting him up and bringing him into the barracks. Verse 36. Oh, I thought I heard something. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, away with him, away with him, away with him. Now, that chant of away with him doesn't mean take him away. It means execute him. It means kill him. In fact, let's go back about 24 years, John 19. Now, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Pilate said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, away with him, crucify him. That's exactly what has happened on the Temple Mount with Paul right now. Crucify him. He's not fit to live. That's what they're yelling. That's what they're screaming. The tribune has no idea what's going on, but they're demanding Paul's life. And so as you think through all of this, it was 24 years ago when Paul was converted, and here we are. Paul will be arrested, and it will start what is known as the house arrest, Paul's imprisonment in Rome. It is during this time that he will write the prison epistles. It is during this time that he'll write Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, what we call the prison epistles. But this will begin a 5-year period under Roman control, under Roman imprisonment of Paul. And again, this brand new document is up on our website with the addition of the Roman rulers of Judea and the high priest there at the top. So that's new to the document. Other than that, it's the same. It just keeps growing every time I see something I want to add. Verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, so they're bringing him into the barracks, they've got him up the stairs, he's about to be brought into the barracks, he looks at the tribune and he says, may I say something to you? And the tribune says to him, do you know Greek? Okay, so imagine what's going on. The crowd is likely speaking Aramaic or Hebrew. They're screaming, they're yelling. He likely doesn't understand anything they're saying. He likely has no idea what's happening. He's getting Paul in there. He thinks Paul is a notorious Egyptian. You'll see it in one verse. And as he's getting him in, Paul speaks to him in Greek. And he says, may I say something to you? And he goes, you know Greek? That was very surprising to him because, again, he thought he was this notorious terrorist. Verse 38. Or excuse me. Yeah, verse 38. Are you not the Egyptian then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins or the Sicaries out into the wilderness? He just exposed who he thought he was. He thought he was this notorious Egyptian Sicarii who led 4,000 other Sicaries out into the wilderness. He thought he was dealing with a real terrorist of the day. Now, Fruchtenbaum in his commentary says this: historically, these Sicarii were known as the dagger men. That's what the word means. These men carried short swords called sakai in Latin. They were enemies of Rome and any Jews who were sympathetic to Rome. They would mingle in large crowds and secretly stab their enemies or cut their throats. So this tribune thinks he's got this bad terrorist Egyptian. He thinks he's caught him on the Temple Mount, and he's shocked when he speaks in Greek because he was not expecting that at all. By the way, Josephus tells us that this event happened. He mentions this Egyptian Sicarii somewhere between 52 and 58 AD, so says Josephus. What's interesting, let me get you back there. What's interesting is that's exactly the time frame that we're looking at. The Sicarii, the Egyptian terrorist that Josephus writes about, is the same one that Luke is writing about. And Christian, you have a question. If I say, well, I didn't hear that.
Are these Egyptians that you were just talking about, are they Jewish?
Oh, good question. So the only Egyptian for sure was the one who led the others in the revolt.
Okay.
So keep in mind, this would have been an Egyptian who led other Jews in a revolt against Rome and ultimately fled to the wilderness. So the revolt itself would have been principally with Jews against the Roman Empire, which the Sicarii hated. And so did the Zealots for that matter. But that's a different story. We'll save that for another day. Okay, get us back on topic. Okay, so any questions? We see what's going on. Paul has just talked to the tribune. Verse 39, Paul replied, I am a Jew. Oh, Rich has a question. I'll read this and then we'll go to Rich. Paul replies, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. So Rich has a question, and we'll unpack that.
When you study scripture, frequently you look at several strains of commentators. And some commentators appeal to you, some don't. And sometimes those commentators turn from commentators to critics. So this is a very key moment in Acts where many critics, and there are quite a few of them, say, there's no way. The guy gets beaten to within a whisper of death. He gets carried away by violence, and he's just, all he can do is exhale, and he's going to say, may I say something to you? And I am, and calmly, I am a Jew from Tarsus and Cilicia, blah, blah, blah. And so many people, and it's a lot of times it's the same people who don't know or don't remember what Paul said when he took the Nazirite vow, that he became all things to all people, and they don't remember how many different times in history individuals who have been brought close to death through martyrdom, the first thing they want to do is stand up and proclaim the gospel, so that critics, who many of them are really good commentators, for some reason this kind of it sticks in their throat, and they can't accept that. But I think for those of us who have faith, and those of us who have read enough about Paul, we know who the man was, and who the man was who gave himself to the Lord. So,
Amen. And again, they forget, I would say, two things, maybe more. Number one, Luke, if he's proven nothing else to us in the book of Acts, in the Gospel of Luke, he has proven to us that he is an eminent historian. He has proven to us that he is an accurate recorder of history and events. There's been many who've attempted to undo things Luke have said, and in the end, every time they've proven to be wrong. Luke has proven to be an accurate historian. Number two, we must never forget that the scriptures are more than just the product of one man. The Bible tells us that holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. The idea is the way the wind fills the sails of a sailboat. God moved men to write what they knew and what they understood. What we read when we read the scriptures is not just the word of man. It's the word of men inspired by God. Holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. And so we can be certain that coming from an eminent historian, that what we read is indeed accurate as he's moved by the Spirit of God to write. And here you see Paul's reply. Not only am I not Egyptian, I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia. I'm a citizen of this major city. I beg you to permit me to the people. So he is from Tarsus, well to the north, so Jerusalem's down here. He tells him, listen, I'm a Jew. Mom and dad are a Jew. I wasn't born in Jerusalem. I was born in Tarsus, a major city, but I am a Jew. He says it present tense, by the way. He doesn't say I was a Jew or I might be a Jew. I am a Jew. And can I speak to this people? I find it fascinating. To go to Rich's point, these people were just a moment ago attempting to kill him. And his first request, when he gets done crowd surfing before they get them in the barracks, is, can I address these people? Can I address my fellow countrymen? In spite of all the beatings that Paul has received at the hand of the Jews, he has never lost his desire to see his fellow countrymen give their lives to Christ. That candle has not been dimmed 1 ounce. And even though they were just beating him, he wants to tell them about how he met Jesus. And that's what he's going to do. So thank you for that, Rich. So just back on topic, verse 40. And when he had given him permission, so the tribune gave him permission, Paul standing on the steps, and I can picture this in my mind. They're in the Antonia fortress. The Jews are all down there in half a chaos, in tumult, and he motions with his hand to the people. Paul does. And then there was a great hush. He addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, so let's pause right there. I would have never imagined that Paul would do some kind of hand motion and the crowd would calm down. I would have thought just the opposite. He would go like this and they would just go crazier. But never forget what the writer of Proverbs, Solomon, tells us. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As rivers of water, he turns it whithersoever he will. Paul does this, and for some strange reason, the crowd goes silent. and he begins to speak to them in Hebrew. He had just spoken to the tribune in Greek. He now begins to speak to these men, his fellow countrymen, in Hebrew, obviously showing solidarity, obviously showing verbally that he is a Jew. And that brings us to verse 1. And we see his address. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, so just a couple things before we unpack it. Notice how he addresses them. The men who were just beating him, he addresses them as brothers and fathers. Jewish brothers and Jewish fathers. He addresses them in a very respectful way, very kind way. They were just beating him, and yet he addresses them as fellow countrymen and even fellow fathers. What's interesting is Stephen addressed the Sanhedrin with the exact same language. When he was before the Sanhedrin, that's what he said, brothers and fathers, hear me. Here Paul, out of great respect for his fellow countrymen, out of showing solidarity, addresses them in Hebrew. They become extremely quiet. Now, his defense will break into 5 main areas. First, his own Jewish background. Then, his persecution of Christians. Third, how he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Fourth, his baptism, and if you believe the conversion happened then, his conversion, or it happened on the road to Damascus before that, and then his command to go to the Gentiles, and at that point, his discourse will be interrupted. Just so you know, when it says he gives a defense, apologia is the Greek word. It's where we get the word apology and the study of apologetics. It's to give a defense. Paul is giving a defense of who he is and what he believes. And again, now we'll walk through it. Verse 1, his religious, or section 1, his religious background. Verse 3. I am a Jew, he says it again, except this time to the Hebrew crowd. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. That's surprising. We'll talk about it. So Paul begins with, I'm a Jew. I'm a present tense Jew. I was born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but I was brought up in Jerusalem. I was born there. I was brought up here. I was trained here. I was raised here. In fact, I was trained by the leading Pharisee of the day, Gamaliel, under the strict law of a Pharisee. I am, Paul would say, just like you. In fact, look what he says. Not only was I raised according to the strict manner of the law, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I just want to say a point of application. It is interesting to me that he sees their zeal, and there is a sense he understands it. He doesn't attack it because he had the exact same zeal himself once. And he knows, as he wrote to the church in Rome, that they do have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. And that 2 points here. Number one, just because we're zealous of something doesn't make it true. The truth makes it true. Number 2, never forget who you were before God found you. You see, Paul remembered as he's standing there addressing his fellow countrymen, I see that you're zealous for God. I was once just like you. In fact, as you're going to see, I was even worse than you. But see Paul's first point, his number 1 point. I am a Jew just like you. And that brings us to his second point. Not only am I a Jew just like you, I persecuted Christians. You were just trying to beat me. I actually did something much bigger. Verse 4. I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. Paul now begins to describe how he actually killed Christians, killed people of the way, likely leveraging off John 14:6, where Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He said, I persecuted people who were of the way. I killed them. I murdered them. In fact, you can talk to the leading elders here. You can talk to the high priest. I even asked for a letter to go to Damascus. Now, Damascus is a 180-mile trip from Jerusalem. He was so zealous and so wanted to exterminate Christianity that he sought letters to go to Damascus to the synagogue, that if he could find any Jews who were followers of the way, he would bring them bound, whether they were a man or a woman, back to Jerusalem where they were to be punished. We need to see what he's explained to this crowd. There is nothing in my prior past that would have indicated, that would have led me to become a Christian. It was something much bigger than that. In fact, everything in my past would have helped me to continue to be a Pharisee, because I was killing people of this way. I was certain that this was heresy. I was certain that Jesus of Nazareth had not risen from the grave. And I was attempting to execute everyone who did, or at least throw them in prison. And you can see, he explains to them, hey, go talk to the high priest. He'll tell you. I asked for letters. I've made a long trip to Damascus to terminate these people. So not only had nothing in Paul's past predisposed him to become a follower of Jesus, it was the exact opposite. Everything in his past had ensured he never would. And here's the point. I don't know who you're praying for. I don't know which one of your children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors, relatives, whatever, that you're praying they would come to Christ. They are not too far gone. Do not stop praying. If God can call Paul out of darkness into his marvelous light, he can call anyone. No one is too far from the gospel. No one's heart is so far hardened that the Lord can't touch them. Keep praying for them. And you see, as Paul outlined how he persecuted Christians, it now brings us to the third point, Paul's meeting with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. Acts 9. Here, as he's telling his fellow countrymen, he's giving his testimony. And I was on my way and drew near to Damascus. About noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. The Greek word means to flash around. The idea is it's noonday, it's noon in the Middle East, the brightest part of the day. He's traveling on the road to Damascus with some companions, and he sees a very bright light. Now, what would you determine about something that's described as a very bright light in the middle of a Middle Eastern day? It must be very bright. Likely the manifestation of the Shekinah glory of God is shining around Paul, strikes him blind, he falls to the ground. Suddenly, this great light shines around him. He's made this 180-mile trip. He's planning on entering Damascus as the mighty Pharisee. He's planning on bringing these Jews who've converted to Christianity back to Jerusalem where they'll be punished. Man or woman, he doesn't care. And here, outside the city, a bright light shines around him. A great light shines around him and strikes him to the ground. Just a little short story. We recently put a light in we have a barn in our backyard, small storage shed. And so I was at Home Depot. I'm like, I'm going to get the brightest light they got. The brightest shop light they got, that's what I'm getting. It's a man's approach, right? So I put that puppy up there, and you turn the light on, and it's bright, pretty bright. Well, I went out there the other morning in the dark. Okay, first time I turned it on in the dark. That thing was super bright. I was like, whoa, this thing is like burned my retinas out bright. But imagine if you would describe a light as very bright when you see it at noon. That's how the Shekinah glory of God manifests itself there with Paul. Verse 7, and I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, again, if we see little pictures of him, he's fallen off a horse, and he's laying in the ground next to the horse. There's no horse missing in Acts 9 or any of the accounts of his conversion. There's 4 accounts in the Bible, 3 in the book of Acts. A horse is never mentioned. Likely he was just struck to the ground. But if you believe there was a horse, I'm good with that. We don't need to split the class or anything. But notice he's struck to the ground. He's blinded. We'll read about that in a moment. And he hears a voice, and the voice says this, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Okay, so just put yourself in his sandals for just a second. You're out killing Christians, dragging Christians to imprisonment. You're coming into a city where you plan on scoring big. You're struck down blind in the dirt. And in this condition, you hear a voice, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? What would go through your mind? I have no idea what went through his, but I do know what he said. Verse 8, the first half. And Paul answered, "Who are you, Lord?" Now, just so you know, we have no indication that Paul ever heard Jesus teach. Although he was raised in Jerusalem, there's no indication in any of his writings that prior to this experience, Acts 9, that he's recounting here in Acts 22, that he ever heard Jesus teach. It's likely he didn't know Jesus' voice. It's likely this voice, if it was identical to Jesus' earthly voice, wouldn't have struck a chord with him. And I believe he's asking a legitimate question. He's out killing Christians. He's out imprisoning Christians. And this guy is, "What are you doing? You're persecuting me." And he's like, "Who are you, Lord? Who are you?" Kurios is the Greek word. Back half of verse 8. And this voice, he said to me, can you imagine this? "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." In an instant, everything Paul believed to be true was proven to be false. In an instant, everything Paul thought to be true was absolutely false. In spite of all his zeal, in spite of all his effort, in spite of what he thought or believed, here, this one who was crucified, buried, and his followers were claiming he had risen from the dead, but Paul knew that was crazy, is now convinced that Yeshua, the Nazarene, is alive. And what he is doing is not just persecuting believers, he's persecuting him. Can you imagine what went through Paul's mind at that very moment? The very moment he realized he was wrong. Here's my point. I remember the moment I realized I was wrong. I remember the second it came into my mind that everything I understood and everything I believed was all wrong, that there was an absolute sovereign God in the heavens, that I had offended that sovereign God, that I had no hope of escape of coming judgment except through his Son. I remember the moment I understood I was wrong. Greatest moment of my life. If you've never, ever came to that moment where everything you thought you knew, you came to believe was wrong, I would encourage you today, place faith in Jesus Christ, the risen, living Lord. But here, can you imagine the shock and surprise laying in the dust? "Who are you, Lord?" "I'm Yeshua the Nazarene." Verse 9. "Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me." So he had traveling companions as he was going to Damascus to bring back prisoners. And this happens. He falls in the dirt. They see the light too. They hear the sound, but they don't understand the voice. Only Paul understands the voice. So they see the supernatural light. They hear noise, but they can't make it out. It's just noise to them. In fact, here's how it's described in Acts 9. "And the men who were traveling with him," Luke wrote, "stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one." So they heard it, but they couldn't understand it. They didn't see anybody. They saw the great light, Paul said in this verse. So tying this all together, we get they saw the light, we get they heard noise, but they couldn't understand what was being said. And here Paul is having a conversation with this person. Verse 10. "And I said," Paul said, "What shall I do, Lord?" Now, at this point, I think Paul was convinced that Jesus was alive. I don't know what else it would take if you don't believe it at this point. If you're laying in the dirt blind and a voice is talking to you and you're having a conversation with someone from the heavens, I don't know what more it would take. But you see his response, "What shall I do, Lord?" The Lord said to him, "Rise, go to Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do." Don't miss the 3 points. The Lord says, "Okay, get out of the dirt. Stand up and go to Damascus." Okay, let's just stop for a second. Paul had grand ideas probably of what it was going to be like when he rode and strolled into Damascus. He was the mighty Pharisee, going there to bring these ignorant Jews who converted to Christianity back to Jerusalem where they would be punished for their crime. And now he's going to be led into Damascus like a little boy, blind. He had one idea of what going to Damascus was going to be like. God had quite a different idea. And then thirdly, notice what Luke says, what the Lord says. There you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. God has a plan for your life, and there he will share with you his plan for your life, Paul. Can you imagine? Verse 11. And since I could not see, because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. Now, as I was reflecting on this, as I was reflecting on what Paul thought that trip to Damascus was going to be like and what it actually turned into, strangely enough, we have this verse Saturday, men, in our study. Oh, sorry. We have this verse in our study Saturday. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. I can think of no greater example of a man planning his way and the Lord shaking his life up. The same was true of me. I can think of another example where I was planning my way and the Lord stepped in and shook things up. And here, that's exactly what happened to Paul. And Paul is sharing his testimony with men who just a moment ago were trying to kill him. Any questions before we advance? He now talks about his baptism when Ananias came to him. Verse 12. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw. Okay, so here he recounts exactly what we read. I'm not going to read it to you in Acts 9 about Ananias. You remember Ananias. He was that reluctant guy who Paul said, go, or God said, go see this guy named Saul. He's like, Lord, I've heard about him. He was sent here to persecute